Hands on, feet on, powered on. On your mark. On is the start of everything. On is the key to learning. Being on an environment, not just in it. Being on the world, not just of it.
Tarkett understands how important on is.
We work on it every day. On the ground with you, designing flooring experiences to grow on, dream on, and get on with it.
Welcome. My name is Jim Detterman. I'm an architect, a principal with Craig Galden Davis in Baltimore. That's an architectural firm. I'm an architect. I'm also a researcher. And today I'm here to present our results from a multidisciplinary research study, which was funded by the American Institute of Architects. And the title of the study is The Impact of Biophilic Design on Student Success. We believe this is the first time ever that biophilic design has been strongly associated with better learning outcomes in a learning space environment. So we think this is a seminal study. So let's begin. There we go. So first of all, we want to thank our benefactors. All of these people and organizations contributed time and money, particularly the American Institute of Architects, College of Fellows, and the Board Knowledge Committee. And everyone else listed here provided dollars and materials that created the biophilic classroom. So we want to thank them very much. And this is the team. Again, my name is Jim Detterman. I was the principal investigator. Our partners included Dr. Tom Albright, a professor with the Salk Institute, and he specializes in the visual cortex. Bill Browning is a founding partner of Terrapin Bright Green, which is a sustainability and a biophilic design consultant. Then we've got Dr. Marianne Akers, who is the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University here in Baltimore. Paul Archibald, Dr. Archibald is a professor of social work and was responsible for the stress testing portion of the study. Dr. Catherine Martin Dunlop is an instruction expert and was responsible for the surveys and the learning outcomes portion of the study. And Valerie Carrillo is an architect with Hord Copeland Macht and was my associate during the study. So our presentation is divided into three parts. There's the neuroscience basis for the study. Then we talk about biophilia and the history of biophilia and the history of surveys and studies of biophilia, and where do ours fit? And then we talk about the experiment itself, and then finally the findings. So first of all, let's talk about neuroscience. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm an architect, but I have worked with Dr. Albright for 4 years and understand something about the neuroscience basis for our study. And he always likes to start with, can neuroscience tell us anything useful about architecture and design? So let me, first of all, think about the brain as an information processing system. And so through the senses, it organizes, labels, assigns, it stores and uses this information to guide our behavior. Secondly, the natural environment, the visual environment is full of measurable statistics. The neurons in our brain are organized in such a way to facilitate the processing of statistical regularities in the visual world. So let me illustrate what that means. This field of random objects has a pattern in it that it's easy for us to see. And that single pattern, that curve begins where the arrow is. And let me help you with that. You see that there where the red line is? That's that string, that curve that our eye easily picks out of what otherwise is a very random field of objects. So if I show you, if I take away that curvilinear pattern, then you don't see any pattern. You see little bits of every now and then, some of them kind of come together, but you don't see that pattern quite like you do in the original one. So why does our eye see that? It's not a coincidence that the natural world is replete with contours like that curved line. Repeating lines in a collinear, curvilinear, parallel, and radial pattern. They're ubiquitous in the natural world. When we see these contours in nature, the data is easily facilitated by our brain, our processing system. The ease of facilitation translates to us as we find something beautiful, or because it's easy for us to process, it relaxes us, it relieves stress. Architects have at least subconsciously known this for hundreds of years. So on the left-hand side, you see Fay Jones' Thorncrown Chapel. And the repeating radial lines that are not quite parallel are what universally human beings find beautiful. The radial patterns in the North Rose window at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, same response. So when the built environment taps into the organization of the visual brain, we can achieve a desired response. Cable stay bridges are universally found to be beautiful. Why is that? The regularity of patterns in space and time facilitate an understanding of the environment that fosters an ease of processing. This is the basis, the neuroscience basis for biophilic design. Now, scientists speculate that these organizational properties of the neuronal system evolved because they easily facilitate detection they give us a selective advantage, okay? So features of nature that our early ancestors relied on for survival have similarity in contours, and we've developed this ease of detection of these things, which help them to survive. They've passed that detection ability down to us. And now we find these patterns as beautiful, satisfying, and attractive. They make us feel relaxed. They make us feel happy. Now, there's a much more in-depth discussion about this in Dr. Albright's book called Mind in Architecture. And he wrote a chapter in that book about neuroscience and architecture. I think Giuliani Polasma is the editor of that book. But Mind in Architecture, if you want to do a deeper dive into this neuroscience theory that we're talking about. But now let's talk about biophilic design. What is biophilia? And why do certain places make us feel good? Biophilia is the theory that humans are innately connected to nature, right? Became popular back in the 80s. There was a lot of research before the 80s, but it really became popular again in the 80s with a book called The Biophilia Hypothesis by E.O. Wilson. And there's been, I would say, dozens of studies that have connected biophilic design to better human performance, mostly in healthcare and in workplace, because we speculate these were funded studies, that there was an interest in them. So the Ulrich study is a classic study in 1984 that was done in a healthcare setting. And they looked at patient recovery times in patient rooms, recovery rooms that looked out to vegetation, and other rooms that just looked out to a brick wall. And what they found were that patients had shorter hospital stays, they had fewer negative comments, but mostly they were able to move patients, get patients well faster, move them out, and move other patients in. And this had a financial benefit to the healthcare provider. So here's just a view of the vegetation outside the hospital window. Actually, on the balconies outside the window is where they provided the vegetation. So in 2008, there was a study by Kahn about visual response to nature. And they compared looking at nature through a glass window, real nature, to fake nature, looking at nature on a plasma screen, on photographs of nature, and then looking at no nature at all, just the wall. And what they found were that looking through the nature through the glass lowered blood pressure faster than looking at fake nature or no window at all. But what's very interesting is that the anatomic response to looking at fake nature on a plasma screen was almost as good as looking at real nature. So there was still a benefit. So let's talk about fractals. Fractals, like a snowflake, they encourage, they relax us, they calm us, they encourage perceptual thinking rather than cognitive thinking. And humans have a preference for looking at fractals. So a snowflake, crystals on a glass, frozen glass, trees, a branch that breaks into two, and then each one of those breaks into two. That's a fractal. Fire is a statistical fractal. So we love looking at fire. It relaxes us. Now, the shadow, this was a study that was done using the shadow of a tree in a space. That's actually also a statistical fractal. And looking at the shadow of that vegetation in a space calms us, lowers our blood pressure, makes us feel relaxed. And we actually use something similar to this in our study. Discussion about biophilic design has been going on for hundreds of years. The first one to comment about it was Frederick Law Olmsted in 1865, when he talked about the enjoyment of scenery and feeling like you're in this place of soft fascination. So this is not a new understanding. The health benefits of the natural environment has been studied and proven over and over. Now, what we're trying to do is understand why we react that way in the natural environment, apply it to the built environment. Being out in nature takes us away from directed attention fatigue. So a lot of times, particularly in LearningSCAPES, when you see students with their head down, it probably means there's been an instructor doing what I'm doing now, which is droning on for 45 minutes, and students put their head down. They're just fatigued by having directed attention for that amount of time. So giving little breaks of being able to at least visually go to nature gives you a positive break and actually produces an opportunity to come back to the classes being taught and have better attention skills. And in this next study, Lee Williams and Sargent in 2015, they proved that. They had people look out at a rooftop that was just bare, just a roof, a black roof membrane. And then they had them look out at the rooftop that was covered with greenery and flowers. And what they found were that it lowered the stress. You had much less stress in people that looked at the flowers, and that their attention level was much higher when they went back to their directed attention event. Now in 2018, this is actually happening while we were doing our study in Harvard. This is a researcher that examined looking out a window in nature, being present with nature, and then compared that with virtual reality, seeing nature through the goggles. And what they found were that the views to nature actually lowered blood pressure, lowered skin conductance, in his case, improved short-term memory, and made us have more positive emotions. But very interestingly, it was almost an identical reaction with virtual reality. Very, very similar physical reactions to looking at nature using virtual reality. Then in 2015, there was a study, very few studies done in LearningSCAPES, but in Barcelona in 2015, there was a study done with thousands of school children, 36 schools in the lower grades of elementary school. And they looked at students that walked to school under a green canopy and had a lot of green canopy at their school versus students that were in a more of an urban environment that did not have the benefits of greenery either on the walk or at school. And you can see in the bar graph there that the green, these were the students that had the benefit of the green canopy. Their cognition actually improved much faster. Their cognition improved faster when they had the benefit of a green canopy. So lots of studies, a few studies about LearningSCAPES, but none really ever attached LearningSCAPES to learning outcomes. So we're the first to do that. And in order to get there, we look at the biophilic design devices, patterns, as Terrapin Bright Green would call them. And they're in three different categories: the nature in space, natural analogs. These are patterns that repeat a natural pattern, and then the nature of space. Some of you have heard of prospect and refuge. So the nature of space, if I can see a long distance, this calms me. I can see there's no imminent threat. Or refuge, being in an enclosed space, that I can see a long distance, but I'm actually sheltered. That's a refuge. And that's what I talk about when I say nature of space. So Terrapin Bright Green is most well known for their 14 patterns of biophilic design. They're in the three different categories that we just discussed. And these are the design devices that pretty much, this just convenes all of the biophilic study history that's been going on for 40 years in a really good, concise book that is very informative to designers and people that are responsible for the design of LearningSCAPES or any space to be able to use biophilia to enhance human performance in that space. So 14 different, and actually they've got 15 now. The 15th is awe, which is great for LearningSCAPES designers, so awe. And this is a page from the 14 patterns that actually looks at the 14 patterns, and above you can see the reactions that surveys and research that's proven have taken place: stress reduction, cognitive performance, motion, mood, and visual preference. And so these are all findings of studies that have strongly suggested these reactions when we use these elements of biophilic design. So we've looked at the neuroscience basis, we've looked at the history of biophilic design. Now let's take a look at our study, and we're going to talk about the methodology, and then at the very end, the findings. And hopefully at the end, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. So I always like to use this slide just because it makes me feel good. There are definitely patterns that we talked about from the neuroscience basis here in all of these images. So let's begin and take a look at the experiment. The objective of the experiment was to test and understand the contribution of a biophilic learning space to reduce student stress and enhanced learning outcomes. So we've got to be very specific. This is what we are aiming to do with the experiment. And like any experiment, basically we had two classrooms. One was a biophilic classroom that we enriched with biophilic devices, and the other was a control classroom. And we had two things we're testing for: student stress as well as a learning outcomes improvement. And we've got two different controls for that. So I'll explain that as we go. So how did we take a classroom and enhance it with biophilic elements? So the first thing we did was we used visual connection with nature. And if so, here's just a kind of an imagery example from the New York Times building, I believe, in New York, where they've used it very successfully. And at the top, you can see a snip from the 14 patterns. Visual connection with nature is responsible, it has been proven by previous research to reduce stress, improve cognitive performance, and improve mood. So this sounded like a slam dunk for, if you're going to choose something for learning space, visual connection with nature is a good one. Secondly, we chose dynamic and diffused light. And you can see examples of what we're talking about there. Pretty much if you're walking under a tree canopy and there's dappled light that comes through from that tree canopy, you're in diffused light. And that specifically is something that triggers a relaxed response from human beings. And dynamic, meaning that it changes. So that's important to our circadian rhythm, that we understand the change of color, the change of light intensity, the environmental changes that all make this real daylight for us. So we understand that and react to that differently than just standard artificial light. And again, you can see the studies that have strongly associated dynamic and diffused light with stress reduction. And then finally, biomorphic forms and patterns. This is really what the Salk was talking about. The patterns that we see in nature, if we can apply them to learning space, they'll be this trigger to reduce stress. And what you're looking at there is the center of a sunflower seed, and you see a radial type of line. That is the pattern that we're talking about. If you're familiar with the Fibonacci sequence, that tries to recreate that radial line, that golden spiral that we see in the center of the sunflower. If I look at rows of crops in a field, as they all sort of go back, these again are not parallel, but they're collinear. And just like the cable stayed bridge, they go back in perspective to a single point somewhere in the far distance. And that again is a pattern that triggers a stress relieving response for human beings. So the three patterns that we're talking about are visual connection with nature, dynamic diffused light, biomorphic forms and patterns, and we get a bonus, non-rhythmic sensory stimuli. So that's a lot of words. And I always have to tell a story to describe what that is. So if I have my classroom and I've got a whole wall of windows over in my periphery, I'm going to get a view to nature out. As long as the blinds are up, I'm going to get a view to nature. But that non-rhythmic sensory stimuli is if the wind catches the trees and they move non-rhythmically, right? It's not a standard rhythm. Or a bird or a butterfly or something comes into the space. That's going to get my attention as a student in that room, and it may draw my eye. And just like the directed attention fatigue student, I want to look at whatever that is out that window. It does a couple of things. My eye muscles zoom out from 5 meters if I'm right there in front of a teacher to more than 30 meters, and I'm looking outside in nature. And if I hold that gaze for 30 to 40 seconds and then come back, then my attention has been regenerated. Right, so it was called that's the attention restoration theory, and it makes a student more apt to be able to take in content more efficiently after they've had that little break. So whereas we used to design schools with no windows, now we say, that's really important, and with the kids looking out the window, that's okay. He needs a break. He'll come back. He'll be able to absorb more of the content that's being presented. So let's talk about the experiment. We did this at a public middle school. It's a charter school in Baltimore City. Baltimore City Public Schools charter school called Green Street Academy. We did a renovation of this 1925 building. Unfortunately, it's actually situated exactly wrong for those designers that know how you do a school. All the windows you want facing north and south, because you can control the daylight and the sunlight on the north and south and not so much on the east-west. All the classrooms here are facing east-west. They didn't know about that in 1925. So we had a challenge there. But this is actually an aerial of what that building is, about 130,000 square feet. This is a it's a sixth grade to 12th grade school. And we were working with middle schoolers in our study. Here's a view of the back. It's a very innovative program for this charter school. And one of the programs they have is urban agriculture. So there already is a lot of green space, and students are already working, in hoop houses, and they raise chickens. So it's a very innovative program, and we thought it's the perfect place to provide this innovative study. So here is the classroom before we enriched it with biophilic enhancements, okay? One thing you see, a lot of the opaque mini blinds are down, okay? Again, these classrooms are facing east. So in the morning when that sun rises, sun's coming right in, the first thing that teacher does is put the blinds down, and a lot of times they don't go back up until June, right? Because they want to darken that room for projection. So students are robbed from their ability to have view to nature and also daylight, which we know from studies long ago improve test scores when you maximize daylight in a classroom. But otherwise, what you're seeing are, it's a hardwood floor. We've got whiteboard all the way around on all the walls except the window wall. And then you've got this space above. And what you see is a lot of teaching aids on the walls. So here's a view of the control classroom. Now here's we didn't ask them to close those blinds. We didn't direct this teacher in any way, but the blinds were closed in this control classroom. And as you can see, even the little pilasters between the windows are covered with teaching aids. Look at the next slide. Look at that. The whiteboards are actually being used for teaching aids all around the classroom. Very first thing the neuroscientist said to us was, this is doing more harm than good for these students. This overstimulation of visual data gives no rest for the eye inside a classroom. So I want to stay in my lane. I'm an architect. I'm not a teacher. I don't want to tell anybody how to teach. But when you're using the physical environment like this, the scientists are telling us that this is too much, and you've got to be able to have some calm and some visual relief inside that classroom. This is a rendering of the biophilic classroom with the visual enhancements. So let's talk about what we did. Very first thing was a view to nature. So we planted a garden outside the window. It does not have to be extravagant. We did try to find plant material that held onto their leaves a lot through the wintertime. We wanted them to be deciduous, some evergreen. But again, if you get a little bit of wind and that leaf catches the wind and it's going to make things move, we wanted to be able to have leaves on the trees through the winter months to do that. And we wanted flowering trees so that in the spring and in the fall, you're going to attract habitat to get that non-rhythmic sensory stimuli out the window. So view to nature, very important. Secondly, dynamic and diffused lighting. And we got rid of the opaque blinds and we put in mecho shades that are a weaved fabric. So it's translucent. You're always going to see some soft light coming through, even when those blinds are all the way down. And we put these shades on a solar cell. So we took the teacher operation out of it. And in the morning when that sun is beating on that glass, the solar cell has the shades all the way down. And then as the sun starts to move, sun comes off the glass, shades move up a little bit and up a little more, finally all the way up. So it just takes the teacher operation out of it. So she's busy doing, or he's busy doing what they need to do to teach students. They don't need to worry about getting daylight and view to nature into the students, but we don't want to rob them of it in case that gets forgotten. The other thing that we did on the shades was we imprinted the image of the shadow of a tree so that you're getting that statistical fractal on that surface, even when the shades are all the way down, okay? It's extremely cheap to do that. The only expensive thing about what we're talking about here is providing motorization on those shades, okay? Solar cells cheap, Printing on the shades is cheap. Meco shade relatively inexpensive. Motorizing is the expensive part of it. And again, I think a lot of this works even without the motorization. So then we did the biomorphic forms and patterns. So you'll notice a few things. On the wall above the whiteboards, if you can see my mouse, on the wall there, we did a wall covering that had a pattern designed by a collaboration between the neuroscientist and an artist that we use from Design Text, a company by Steelcase. And they collaborated and all the science that had to do with, we actually started with the image of a palm fronds, and we sort of abstracted that and created this pattern. Interestingly, color is not a part of a lot of biophilic studies. So we use a very muted color. It was really more about pattern that we put on 3 walls above the whiteboard. We asked the instructor to not put anything on the walls, or if she had to, please minimize that. She resisted it first. And part of the problem is these teachers are evaluated on the learning aids that they have up for students to use. So they want to do a good job. They want to cover every square inch with learning aids. So hopefully this study can help solve that. But the teacher found another way. She created a binder for every student to have the learning aids, and you'll see how it worked out in the end. We also found a carpet by Interface. Interface has several lines that use biophilia as an inspiration. So we used a prairie grass pattern on the floor. And then we found this interesting ceiling, 3-dimensional ceiling by Turf. This product is called Swell. And if you know Turf, they use a lot of felt products. So there's vertical pieces of felt that are spaced apart, and then they just carve the bottom into this wave pattern. So anyway, the neuroscientists love the pattern of that for biophilic design. So that's all we did. Relatively inexpensive. These were relatively minimal interventions as a renovation to an existing classroom. And you can see the softness inside this classroom, I think. And then here's some actual images of the shades with you can see the shadow print on them. You can see nothing on the whiteboards. It's all very clean. You can see the pattern above the whiteboards. There's the prairie grass by Interface. And there's the garden outside. Now, you do not need to do anything as extravagant as this garden. We had a very generous benefactor that provided the garden and walking paths and sitting stones, and students go out into this garden. So this is something that's very beneficial to the school, but you don't need anything this extravagant outside that window. So we have our 2 classrooms, our control and our biophilic classroom, and every study is only as good as the assessment. So we assessed our students 4 different ways. We looked at their stress, and we actually measured their stress by having them do a finger clip-on using a heart rate variability monitor. And that goes to a smartphone, and then the data goes to the cloud. We provided surveys to the students for both stress and learning outcomes as the study started and at the end of the study. We did interviews with students and the instructor. And then we looked at learning outcomes, and we compared learning outcomes from our biophilic students to a control. It's a different control than I've already described, but I'll explain that later. So 4 different ways of assessment. You don't like one, there's 3 others. Now, let's take a look at the findings. The very first thing that we want to look at, we want to hear from the students themselves. We picked out, for this presentation, we picked out interviews from 3 students. They were all very similar, but it's nothing like hearing right from their own voices. So now we have a couple of videos where you can hear directly from them what their thoughts were, first from the students.
It gives me a more purpose to learn, knowing that I'm like in a good environment. Like I'm sitting like by the light, so it's like better for me to understand or like view what's going on in the classroom. And I'm more comfortable in the classroom.
Well, along with the floors and the lighting and stuff, it just makes it easier for me to focus more and get back into what I'm doing. Because it kind of draws out the distractions and stuff that might be happening around me, so it can make it easier for me to stay focused on what I'm doing.
Do these things help you learn math, do you think?
It relaxes you.
It what?
Relaxes you.
Relaxes you. How does it do that?
Because with the light of the sun makes it concentrate better instead of having the regular lights.
Most of the time, my stress level is very calm and nothing really to stress about.
So in other classrooms, you stay stressed, but in this math classroom, tell me again?
It goes down and I can refocus and calm down from where I was stressful and get back to what I'm doing.
Do you ever feel stressed in that classroom?
For the test, no.
No. Good for you. Never. You just take the test and you're done.
Yes.
Wow.
Oh, the blinds, how they go up and down automatically, so it's a really nice lighting in there.
How does that affect your learning?
Mainly because I have really bad eyes, so it can make it easier for me to see certain things on the board.
What I would see is the windows.
Windows.
Yeah, there's sunlight coming in through on Sunday.
How does that compare to other classrooms, those windows, when you first go in that classroom?
Looks like in my other classes, the blinds are always closed.
Oh. But you prefer them open,
Yes.
the sunlight.
The ceiling,
What about it?
The ceiling.
and those waves it has, they see it,
Why do you like that?
it calms you.
It what?
When you turn the air on and you're under, it cools you down, especially when it's hot outside.
So I love that the wave ceiling cools down Kerbin. He's associating that with the thing that cools him down. So now there's a great interview here, just a couple of minutes from the teacher.
Probably what it was like to teach in this class. What are your thoughts about this classroom? What do you think about it?
The room is beautiful. Like it feels very homey. It feels like it's a comfortable space to be in. The windows, being able to get that natural light in here at different times of the day is I really enjoy the windows. Outside, the scenery, now that it's spring, it's all nice and everything has bloomed. You can see all the trees and things outside. So it's a space you can easily just get caught up staring outside. And I've noticed that students do that too. And then they quickly kind of get themselves back together. Like it helps with kids that are having a difficult time and they just kind of space out for a minute and then they come back.
Yeah.
We just did our state testing park last week, and I noticed earlier this week actually for math, and it was a lot of them, they wanted to face the direction of the windows during testing. Usually they face either the rear of the room or the front of the room, but they all voted to face the windows so that they can look outside. And that, I don't know if it was the swaying of the trees or whatever it was outside going on, it seemed to kind of calm them, so they were less anxious when they were taking the assessment. And that part I really like, because they didn't seem as tense as some other scholars are when they just have to face the wall during testing.
Did you notice anything different about the students' behavior, performance, or mood?
Their mood was, it just seemed like they would come in a rush and frantic and chaotic, but then after a while they would just kind of calm themselves down. And I mean, it could be attributed to the room, it could be the lighting in here, it could be because everything is a little softer in here. A lot of behavior shifts in the spring. I don't know if it's a hormonal thing or what it is, but their behavior seems to shift in the spring, sometimes for the better, sometimes it's just a little different. But I think being in a setting where they are is kind of like surrounded by, say, like a lack of chaos, a lack of clutter, a lack of just a lot of extraneous stimuli, they kind of calm it down.
Good. That's good. Did you notice anything different about your stress level, attention level, behavior, performance?
It is calmer in here. So a lot of times I will just turn the classroom lights off, let the natural light in, and kind of calm myself, especially if it's a class that can be a little more rambunctious than the others. I will sit in a student desk and stare out the window myself if I need to. I think, to me, the space is really nice. Like I said, I've said a few times that it feels homey. Like I used to live in a wooded area, so it's just kind of like, oh, this is peaceful. I've had other teachers come in here just to calm themselves down. They don't want to eat in here because they don't want to get anything on the carpet, but they will come in and say, I actually do feel calmer in this space. Like it's really comfortable being in a space like this versus what they're normally used to.
So I love that interview. Just fantastic data comes from that teacher interview. And she began this study somewhat resistant to what we were doing, but has become a total convert after the year in our classroom. All right, let's take a look at some of the more measurable metrics. So at the beginning of the research study, we did a survey, and then we surveyed again at the end in both the biophilic and the control classroom. And again, we didn't change anything in the control classroom. We didn't give the teacher any advice or any change to make. It was just, we were comparing the reaction of the biophilic enhancements to a regular classroom. So the survey that we gave in the beginning, the first survey, asked about students' perception of their own stress, okay? And as you can see in the biophilic classroom, even in the beginning, the students felt, in the pretest, which is the blue bar, the students felt already less stressed than the students that were in the control classroom. So their answers were telling us they were already feeling better in that classroom. But then you can see at the end, both stresses came down at the end. But in the biophilic classroom, students were feeling less stressed in both the pre and the post test. Now, in the another survey we gave was, how did you feel about the learning in each space? And there were questions that were divided into 3 different scales. The students' perception of the physical space, their enjoyment of math lessons, this was a math class, and their level of involvement, their perception of their level of involvement in the class. The biophilic classroom is in blue, and then the control classroom is in gray. As you can see, we're getting more positive responses in all 3 scales from the students in the biophilic classroom. And that's both, I think we just gave this once, right at the end of the study. So again, remember the objective of the experiment was to understand about student stress and also about learning outcomes. So the first big piece here is student stress. And we used heart rate variability as our measure of that. So let's talk about that. We used a device from Elite HRV that is a finger clip-on that measures your variable heart rate. Now, not the actual heart rate, but as you can see in those upbeats on the heart rate that we're all familiar with, variation in those upbeats is a sign of a low stress condition. The more variation that we have is low stress. And the way it's been described to me is when I take a breath, my heart rate goes up, and when I exhale, my heart rate goes down. So when there's a lot of variation, that's a normal breathing, normal non-stress condition. When those things are more steady, then I'm taken out of the normal breathing, the normal heart rate, and that's more of a stressful condition. So the more variation that we see, the less stress. That's the condition that we want. And again, there were 19 students. I can't get everybody in both classes. Both classes had 24 students. 19 students in the biophilic classroom participated. 19 students in the control classroom participated. Again, these were 6th grade students. We had to get permission from Baltimore City Public Schools and their parents. And so 19 of them participated. Every student had their own heart rate monitor that they used, and that was theirs. No one else used it. And they all had a smartphone. We bought each of them a smartphone with an app on it so that the heart rate monitor spoke to the smartphone, and then the app put the data up in the cloud and aggregated everything. And we had 2 great graduate students from Morgan State University that facilitated all of this. And we measured student HRV for the first minute and the last minute of classes 3 times a week for 4 months in both the biophilic and the control classroom, okay? Now, if you were sharp, you're noticing that the control classroom is a 7th grade class, biophilic is 6th grade. So this is data that's interesting. There's a lot of data that we think is pretty good and valid, but we do not control for course content or teacher. So there's a couple of variables that are not controlled, but still, let's take a look at the data and see of what interest it could be. So the raw data looked like this. The student's identity were blind to us. Students were identified by a letter. B means biophilic classroom, and by a number. This is student B12, 12th student in the biophilic classroom. Now we measured their HRV the first minute and the last minute of classes 3 times a week. So you can see here in the 3rd column, we've got the same date and the start time of the test, 1st and 2nd test, and the duration of the test. These are in seconds. And then the HRV score is here. The first test in this case was 73. The second test was a 68. Remember, the higher the test score, the better. The more variation that we have in the HRV, the higher the number, okay? So we don't like this. On the very first day, the student was in a less stressful condition at the beginning than they were at the end. But if you look at all the data for the month, this student, you can see the average HRV score was there. But you see, we look at the delta. We're not just interested in the average score, because we all come through the world with different levels of anxiety and different levels of stress. We were interested in the change of that stress as a result of their experience in that classroom, okay? So if I see a negative number, that's not good. I want to see a positive. Start at a certain baseline, and I'm less stressed at the end. So looking at the whole month, the student did pretty good, 21 into the positive, meaning typically they were less stressed at the end of class than they were in the beginning. So now, let's look at all the scores. February, March, April, and May, this was our testing period. Gray is the control classroom, blue is the biophilic. And once again, the higher the score, the less stress. Now we averaged just all the raw readings to begin with. And you can see the number of readings here. It's quite significant. There were about 1,500 total readings done on the stress portion of this test. But we looked at this data and we said, uh-oh, this didn't really work out too well, because it looks like the average HRV score in our control classroom is higher than the biophilic. Those kids in the 7th grade were less stressed than the kids in the 6th grade. So again, we said, okay, that's interesting. As a group, they were less stressed in the biophilic, or more stressed in the biophilic classroom. But how did that change as a result of their exposure to that classroom? So we looked at the delta, okay? February, March, April, May. Gray is the control, the blue is the biophilic. Again, the number of readings are here. Look at the delta in February. The delta of that first reading to the second reading, the average of the delta for the month of February, these students had a higher HRV score in the control classroom, 0.716. But look at the biophilic, more than double. Look at March. We continue to go up, 1.862. Look at April. Look at the delta in April. Huge difference between the control classroom and the biophilic classroom. And then look at May, about down, a little bit more down to earth. We talked to the teacher and we said, what happened in April? Did somebody get it? You didn't take any tests, or there was a test in the control and not the biophilic? And they said, nope. She said, spring happened. Flowers bloomed, vegetation came on the tree. That was the only thing that she could think of. And this was the actual result. Again, the higher the number, the less stressed. So we like to see that higher number. So then we just took the average for the whole month. The first one was the daily delta, but look at the cumulative average for the whole month for each class. And you really start to see cumulatively how less stressed the students in the biophilic classroom are. So the real need of it for me was the learning outcomes. Are we designing classrooms where students are actually learning better? So let's take a look at this data. This school uses the iReady score, the iReady test to do diagnostic testing. We didn't want to just look at grades because grades can be somewhat subjective, but the iReady test is an adaptive assessment test given in September and December and March. Okay, and they look at how students grow in their cognition of math, and this is very helpful for teachers. And we thought this would be a really good standardized way of getting learning outcomes in our study. So here we go: September, December, March, the 3 different testing times. 459.59 is the average score for students in the control classroom. Oh, by the way, let me go back a bit. I mentioned it earlier on that the control classroom for the learning portion was different. We didn't use a different grade, a different teacher. The control classroom and the learning portion was the students from the year before. Same teacher, same classroom, same course content, same solar orientation of the windows. Everything was the same. Students were obviously different, but the same demographic. And the only difference was the biophilic enhancements in the biophilic classroom. So every variable is controlled. Teacher, course content, classroom, all the same except for biophilic enhancements, the only difference. So this is a really locked down, controlled variable study. Look at the average test scores in September, 459.59, almost identical in the biophilic classroom shown in green. Then moved to December. Look at the difference. Then moved to March. Look at that difference. Now, the teachers look at the average gain to know that they're making a difference. Cognition in math is actually improving. So look at the control classroom at the average gain. Again, the control classroom with no biophilic enhancements, average gain of 5.48. And then look at the average gain in the biophilic classroom the year after, 18.45. The average test score gain is more than 3 times higher in the biophilic classroom. And again, same teacher, same course, same basic classroom, biophilic enhancements, the only difference. And minimal, they were minimal interventions. And look at the difference that made. Coming down the home stretch here. They also measure who's testing at grade level. So out of 122 to 125 students at the beginning of the year, 56, 57 students, about the same in both the control and the biophilic classroom, were testing at grade level. And then in March, 9 more students testing at grade level, 7.2% better. So just as a summary of what we've seen, in the biophilic classroom, stress reduction was significantly higher compared to the control classroom. improvement in math test scores, in math cognition over that 7-month period. The gain was more than 3 times higher in the biophilic classroom than in the control classroom. And the students themselves stated that they felt more relaxed, calm, easier to focus, have more of a purpose to learn in the biophilic classroom when they compare that to their other classrooms. So really in the affective and the cognitive and the social domain, the biophilic enhancements are really checking all the boxes. So we're just going to finish here, and let me just talk just briefly about the significance of this for me and for our practice. Design has the power to make life better. If a student this early in their academic career can go from a B to an A, or a C to a B, or a D to a C, just by the way we form the physical learning space, we know that contributes by itself. But if we can add, if we can do whatever we can to really tap into the organizational properties of the neurons, use what we know about the health benefits of a natural environment as applied to a physical environment, if we can make it better for these students in one classroom, think about the impact of all the classrooms in that school. And that building's been there since 1925. It'll be there for another 100 years. So for 200 years, think of the impact that architects can make on the lives of people by giving them a little bit of a jolt, a little bit better academic success in their early years. It can change the lives of generations of young people. Shouldn't that be at least part of the criteria for evaluating if architecture is successful? We think so. We use research. We hope you will use this research with your clients to convince them that architecture and design matters. And with that, I'm going to close. And if there's time, we're happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.